My name is Arthur Corbin. I'm 63 years old. For 32 of those years, I worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Not in one of the flashy departments you see on television. I wasn't a profiler or a hostage negotiator. I was in technical surveillance, countermeasures. The guy who swept a room for bugs, who knew how a pressure plate was wired, who could look at a security system layout and see the holes in it. It was a job that rewarded methodical thinking and a deep, abiding skepticism. You had to assume someone was always lying, always trying to get one over on you, whether it was a hostile foreign agent or the salesman pitching you a new infrared camera. I saw a lot of strange things in my career, but they all had explanations. Human things. Greed, desperation, fanaticism. The world made a certain kind of grim, predictable sense. When I retired, I thought I was done with all that. I took a job that was supposed to be the opposite of my old life, head of security for a private estate in the Pacific Northwest. The owner was one of those tech billionaires who wanted to unplug from the world he'd helped create. He bought a couple thousand acres of dense, old-growth forest in northern Washington, built a compound in the middle of it, and hired me to make sure nobody bothered him. It was quiet work, mostly just me, a small support staff that rotated out, and the trees. For 2 years, the biggest threat I dealt with was a persistent black bear that had figured out how to jimmy the lid on the industrial dumpsters. I thought I'd finally found a place where the world made sense in a different way, a simple way. Then came the events of last October. I'm telling this story because the official channels are a dead end. Because when you see something that doesn't fit in any of the boxes, they just build a new box called unexplained and file you away in it. I have a recording. It's not much. To the naked ear, it's mostly static, wind noise, and some low-frequency guttural sounds that the analysts I used to work with couldn't identify. But I was there. I know what was being communicated. And I think people need to know what's really out there, hiding in the quiet places. Before I get into what happened, if you're new here, consider subscribing. I plan to share more of what I've learned since this all went down. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It helps, knowing I'm not just shouting into the void. All right, let me tell you what happened. The estate, which I'll call Northwood for the sake of privacy, was a paradox. The house itself was a marvel of modern architecture, all glass and steel and geothermal heating, but the security system was my design, and it was old-school brutalist. A 10-foot-high chain-link fence, military grade, with a 2-foot buried apron to stop anything from digging under. The top was crowned with 3 strands of concertina wire. Every 100 yards, there was a pole with a 360-degree thermal imaging camera and a passive infrared sensor. The whole 5-mile perimeter was a closed circuit. If a deer so much as breathed on the fence, I knew about it. The system was my baby. I knew its every quirk, every false positive. The cluster of sensors on the south ridge that would sometimes get triggered by rockfalls and high wind. The camera on Gate 2 that had a slight image burn from the sun hitting it at a specific angle in the late afternoon. I lived and breathed that system. For 2 years, it was as predictable as the tides. The animals were the main source of traffic. Herds of elk, black-tailed deer, the occasional cougar that would pace the fence line for a night before moving on. We had a rich ecosystem. The woods were loud. Birds during the day, owls and coyotes at night. The sound was a constant, comforting blanket. The first thing that went wrong was the silence. It didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual tapering off, something you feel more than hear. It was early October, the air getting that crisp, wet edge to it. I was doing my morning check of the system logs, drinking a cup of coffee that was more chicory than bean, and I noticed the overnight wildlife triggers were down. Way down. from an average of 50 or 60 a night to less than 10. I didn't think much of it at first. Animals migrate, their patterns change. I made a note in the log and went about my day. But it continued. A week later, the triggers were down to 1 or 2 a night, and the woods were quiet. The jays and the squirrels, usually a constant racket, were gone. The evening chorus of frogs from the big pond near the western fence just stopped. The client, Mr. Reed, even noticed. He had 2 big Rhodesian Ridgebacks, beautiful, fearless dogs.
They went from spending their days roaming the inner grounds to sticking close to the house, whining at the door, the hackles on their backs constantly raised. That's when I started to feel it. That old professional prickle on the back of my neck. The feeling that a variable has been introduced into a stable equation. I started running active patrols myself instead of just relying on the cameras. I'd take one of the electric UTVs and drive the entire 5-mile perimeter road twice a day, once in the morning, once just after dusk. I was looking for signs of human intrusion, cut wire, tracks, discarded trash, anything to explain the change. I found nothing. The fence was secure. The ground was undisturbed, save for a carpet of damp pine needles. But the feeling got worse. The woods felt watched. It's a hard thing to describe if you haven't felt it. It's not just paranoia. It's a sensory input. The way the air pressure feels, the way the light filters through the trees. Everything seems to be holding its breath, waiting. My training kicked in. I started thinking like I was back in the field. What's the anomaly? The absence of animals. Why would they leave? A new predator. A big one. A grizzly, maybe, though they weren't common this far west. Or a pack of wolves. I spent 2 days looking for tracks, for scat, for any sign of a large predator. I found nothing. Not a single print that wasn't from the resident deer. Not a single kill site. It was as if the animals had simply vanished. The system started acting up in a new way. It was always the same sector, a 300-yard stretch on the northeast perimeter. It was the most remote part of the property, a steep, thickly wooded hillside that dropped down to a creek. The sensors there would go dead. Not triggered, but dead. Like a power cut. I'd drive out, check the junction box, and find nothing wrong. I'd flip the breaker and everything would come back online. The logs would just show a power interruption. No surge, no short, just off. Then on again. This happened 3 times in 5 days. After the 3rd time, I took a walk down the fence line in that sector. I was armed, carrying my old Sig Sauer P226, the one I'd carried for 20 years at the Bureau. It felt heavy and a little ridiculous, but the woods didn't feel friendly anymore. The ground was soft, covered in a thick mat of moss and decaying leaves. I was about halfway down the section when I saw it. On a massive Douglas fir, about 20 feet from the fence, there were claw marks. That's not unusual. Bears do it all the time. But these were different. They were high up for a start. The top marks were a good 9, maybe 10 feet off the ground. And there were 4 distinct gouges, deep into the bark, running parallel. They were too clean, too precise for a bear. A bear rakes and tears.
This looked deliberate, like someone had taken a garden cultivator and dragged it down the tree with immense force. I stood there for a long time, just looking at it. My brain was cycling through explanations. A prank by the staff? Unlikely. They were all vetted and none of them ever came out this far. A poacher trying to spook us? Possible, but why? What was the goal? Then I looked down. At the base of the tree, in the soft earth, was a single, partial footprint. It was huge, at least 16 inches long, but what made the air catch in my throat was the shape. It was not a bear print.
It wasn't human. It was long and digitigrade, like a dog's, but the impression showed a distinct heel and what looked like 5 toes. It was a shape that my mind had no category for. I took a photo with my phone, my hand shaking just slightly. That was the moment the professional skepticism began to crumble, and a more primal, colder feeling started to take its place. I felt like a man who's been carefully checking the locks on his front door, only to realize the threat is already inside the house, and it wasn't born in a world that understands doors. The next 48 hours were tense. I doubled the patrols and told the few staff on site, a cook and a housekeeper, to stick to the main house after dark. I didn't tell them why. I just cited increased bear activity. They didn't question it. The atmosphere on the estate was thick enough to cut with a knife. The dogs wouldn't go outside at all, not even to relieve themselves. Mr. Reed was getting annoyed, but he was a man who trusted the people he hired, so he left me to it. I spent most of my time in the security office, a small, windowless room in the basement of the main house, staring at the bank of monitors. I had the cameras for the northeast sector on the main screen, cycling through them. I was watching, waiting for something to happen. It was the second night after I found the print. A storm was rolling in from the coast. The wind was howling, and a cold, driving rain was lashing against the building. The trees on the thermal cameras were just white-hot ghosts swaying in a black sea. It was the kind of night that makes a security system almost useless. Too much movement, too much noise. Around 2 a.m. it happened. The power to the northeast sector went out again. Just blinked off the screen. This time, I was ready. I had a UTV prepped with a high-powered spotlight and my gear. I told myself I was going to fix a faulty transformer, but I knew I was going hunting. The drive out was surreal. The wind was trying to tear the vinyl roof off the cart, and the rain was coming in sideways. The narrow gravel road was slick with wet leaves. When I got to the junction box for the dead sector, I left the UTV running, its headlights cutting a swath through the downpour. The box was fine. The breaker was still on. The power was being cut somewhere between the box and the sensors themselves. There was a smaller maintenance path that ran right alongside the fence. I grabbed my maglite, a heavy 4-cell model that could double as a club, and started walking the line. The rain was deafening, a constant roar that drowned out everything else. My world was reduced to the 20-foot circle of light from my flashlight. I was checking the armored conduit that ran along the base of the fence, looking for a break, a short, anything. About 100 yards in, my light caught something that wasn't fence or tree. It was a reflection. 2 small amber points of light, about 30 yards ahead, just off the path. They were low to the ground. My first thought was a coyote or a bobcat pinned by the light. But they weren't blinking, they just stared. And they were too far apart for any coyote I'd ever seen. I stopped walking, my heart starting a low, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I kept the light steady on the eyes. I could hear myself breathing, the sound ragged over the noise of the storm. Slowly, the eyes began to rise. Up and up they went, not like an animal getting to its feet, but like a man standing up from a crouch. 5 feet, 6, 7. They stopped when they were a good 2 feet above my own head. I was frozen. My entire career, my entire life had been based on the principle that things have rational explanations. What I was looking at had none. The beam of my flashlight was shaking now. I could make out a shape, a silhouette against the blackness of the trees. It was massive, broad at the shoulders with a narrow waist. The head was angled down, and the rain was sheeting off a coarse, dark fur. The shape of the head was wrong. It was long, canine, with pointed ears that twitched, catching the sound of the storm. My mind was screaming, "Bear! Bear! Bear!" But it was a lie. A bear doesn't stand like that, so perfectly balanced on two legs.
A bear doesn't have shoulders like a linebacker. A bear's eyes don't glow with that steady, intelligent light. It took a step toward me. It wasn't a lurch or a shuffle. It was a smooth, bipedal stride. And the sound it made when its foot hit the wet ground wasn't the soft pad of a paw. It was the hard impact of a heel and the roll of a long foot. That's when I saw the leg. It was bent backward at the knee, like a dog's. The proportions were all wrong, a nightmarish fusion of man and animal that the natural world should never allow. I finally found my voice. It was supposed to be a shout, an order. "Federal agent, stay where you are!" It came out as a strangled whisper. The thing stopped. It tilted its head, a gesture so unnervingly familiar, so canine that it broke the spell of my paralysis. I started backing away, slowly, never taking the light off it. I was fumbling for the cig on my hip, my fingers feeling like clumsy sausages. The thing just watched me. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't threatening. It was curious. And that was somehow the most terrifying thing of all. I finally got the pistol out of its holster. The familiar weight of it was the only real thing in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. I raised it, my arms trembling, the iron sights a blurry mess in the rain. I centered the flashlight and the gun on the creature's chest. "Don't move," I said, my voice a little stronger this time. The thing let out a sound. It wasn't a growl or a snarl. It was a low, guttural click, like pebbles being knocked together, followed by a soft whine. It was the sound a dog makes when it's confused or trying to understand a command. It took another step. I screamed at it, a raw, primal sound torn from my own throat. "Stop!" It stopped again. And then it did something that shattered the last of my composure. It raised its hand. Not a paw, a hand. It was long and covered in the same dark fur, but the 5 digits were plain to see, ending in thick black claws. It raised it slowly and pointed. Not at me, not at the gun. It pointed at the fence, at the dead security camera on the pole just behind me. And then it looked back at me. The intelligence in those amber eyes was unmistakable. It wasn't just an animal. It knew what the camera was. It knew the power was out. It had created this situation. It had isolated me. My mind, the analytical tool I had trusted for my entire life, just shut down. All the training, all the procedures, they evaporated. I was no longer Art Corbin, retired FBI agent. I was just a piece of meat, standing in the rain in front of something that shouldn't exist. I fired. I didn't aim. I just pointed the gun and squeezed the trigger, once, twice. The flashes lit up the forest for a split second, and in that light, I saw it clearly for the first time. The long, graying muzzle, the powerful jaw lined with yellow teeth that were part wolf, part primate. The thick, matted fur on its chest. The eyes that were not animal, not human, but something ancient and terribly, terribly aware. The bullets hit the tree trunk just to its left, sending splinters of bark into the air. The creature didn't even flinch. It didn't roar or charge. It simply lowered its head, and the light from my flashlight slid off its fur, leaving it in darkness again. But I could still see the eyes. They hadn't moved. And then it was gone. There was no sound of it running, no crashing through the underbrush. It was just there 1 second, and not the next. The silence it left behind was more terrifying than its presence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity,
rain plastering my hair to my skull, the pistol smoking in my hand. The only sounds were the storm and the frantic, panicked drumming of my own heart. I finally broke and ran. I didn't look back. I just sprinted, slipping and sliding on the muddy path, back toward the distant headlights of the UTV. I felt like a child running from a monster in the dark, convinced it was right behind me, its hot breath on my neck. When I reached the cart, I threw myself in, slammed it into gear, and drove back to the house like the devil himself was chasing me. I didn't stop until I was in the concrete basement, the heavy steel door of the security office locked behind me. I sat there, soaking wet and shaking, until the sun came up, watching the dead monitors for a sector that I knew was no longer just a collection of sensors and wires. It was a territory, and I had trespassed. The days that followed were a blur of caffeine and fear. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those amber lights rising in the darkness. I told Mr.
Reed, there was a persistent electrical fault on the northeast line that I couldn't isolate, and that the sector was a blind spot until I could get a specialized crew in. It was a lie, but it was the only one I could think of that would hold water. He was a man who understood technical problems. He would never have understood the real one. I spent my time obsessively reviewing the data. There was nothing. The security logs showed the power failure. The audio sensors from the adjacent sectors picked up nothing but the storm. My 2 gunshots were just muffled pops lost in the wind. There was no evidence that anything had happened. I was alone with it. And that was the worst part. Was I losing my mind? Was it a hallucination brought on by stress and isolation? I've seen men break in the field. I know what it looks like. This didn't feel like that. This felt real. This felt external. On the 3rd day, I knew I had to go back. I had to find some piece of physical evidence to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy. I waited for midday, when the sun was at its highest, chasing the shadows from the forest floor. I took the UTV, but this time I also took a full evidence kit. Sample bags, casting plaster, gloves, old habits. The storm had washed the area clean. The ground was a soft, muddy mess. The partial footprint I had found by the tree was gone, just a puddle of water now. The gouges in the tree were still there, dark and raw against the lighter bark. I photographed them from every angle, with a ruler for scale. I was bagging a few slivers of bark from the edge of the marks when I saw it. A single, coarse, dark hair snagged on a splinter. It was about 4 inches long, wiry, and banded with gray near the root. I carefully tweezed it off the bark and sealed it in an evidence baggie. It was something. It was real. I moved to where I'd last seen the creature. I was looking for shell casings, for blood, for anything. I found my 2 9mm casings, glinting in the mud. I bagged them. And then I found the spot where my bullets had hit the tree. 2 clean holes in the bark. And stuck in the pulpy wood of the second hole was another hair. This one was different. It had been driven into the wood by the force of the bullet's impact. It confirmed the creature had been standing exactly where I thought it had been. It had been so close. I was about to leave when a glint of something not natural caught my eye. Tucked into a small hollow at the base of a fern was a piece of electronics. It was a small black box, about the size of a deck of cards. I recognized it immediately. It was a signal jammer, a cheap, commercially available unit, but one that had been modified. The battery pack was oversized, and the antenna had been replaced with a more powerful one. It was designed to broadcast a wide band of disruptive frequencies. It would have been more than capable of knocking out the sensors in this sector. It was switched off. The battery was dead. This was the explanation for the power outages. It wasn't a fault. It was deliberate. And the creature.
The creature had pointed at the camera. It knew. The implications of that settled on me like a physical weight. This wasn't just a monster hiding in the woods. It was intelligent. It was using tools. It understood our technology, at least enough to know how to disable it. It had been observing us, learning. That night, I made a call to a man I hadn't spoken to in almost a decade. His name was Foster. He and I had come up together in the bureau, but he'd taken a different path. He went into a dark, unacknowledged corner of counterintelligence, the kind of place where they dealt with things that didn't fit the official narrative. The kind of place where a story like mine wouldn't get you a psychiatric evaluation. I told him I had a situation. I told him I needed a favor. I sent him the hair samples and a detailed report, encrypted, of course. Then I waited. My focus shifted from keeping people out to watching what was already inside. I became nocturnal, sleeping a few hours during the day, and spending my nights in the security office, mainlining coffee and staring at the monitors until my eyes burned. I felt like I was under siege. The silence from the woods continued. Nothing moved on the cameras. It was a dead zone. The feeling of being watched was now a constant companion. A week later, Foster called me on a secure line. His voice was grim. "Art," he said, "where did you get this?" I told him a sanitized version of the story. A possible intruder. A strange animal. "The DNA is a nightmare," he said. "The lab is having a meltdown. The mitochondrial DNA is canine. Canis lupus, to be exact. But the nuclear DNA, it's a mess. It's got markers from all over the place. Primate, canine, even some sequences they can't identify at all. They said it's like someone tried to build a genome out of spare parts. The official report is going to say it's a contaminated sample from an unknown canine hybrid, a wolf dog. But off the record, Art, what the hell did you see out there?" I finally told him. I told him everything. The height, the bipedal movement, the hands, the intelligence in its eyes. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I expected him to laugh, to tell me I'd finally lost it, but he didn't. "You need to get out of there, Art," he said, his voice low and serious. "Whatever that thing is, you're in its territory now. These things, they're territorial, and they hold grudges." Foster's warning only confirmed what I already knew. Leaving wasn't an option. I had a responsibility to Mr. Reed. More than that, my professional pride, what was left of it, wouldn't let me run. I couldn't just abandon the field to an unknown hostile. I had to understand what I was dealing with. So I changed my tactics. I was no longer just defending. I was gathering intelligence. I set up a series of my own concealed cameras in the northeast sector, independent of the main system. They were small, battery-powered trail cams, modified to record high-resolution audio as well as video. I placed them overlooking the area where I'd had the encounter, focusing on the game trails and the creek bed. I was baiting a trap, and I knew I was the bait. For 2 weeks, nothing. The woods remained dead. The cameras recorded nothing but swaying branches and falling leaves. I started to doubt myself again. Maybe the creature had moved on. Maybe Foster's warning was just him being spooked by an anomalous lab result. The feeling of being watched had faded, replaced by a dull, grinding tension. I was exhausted, living on a knife's edge. Then, one morning, I was checking the memory card from a camera I'd placed near the creek. The footage was mostly what I expected, hours of empty forest. I was fast-forwarding through the night's recording when I saw it. A flicker of movement. I slowed it down, frame by frame. There, at the edge of the infrared light's reach, was a shape. It was crouched by the water, its back to the camera. It was huge, even hunched over. It was drinking from the creek, scooping water into its mouth with one of those 5-fingered hands. It stayed there for almost a minute. I could see the powerful muscles in its back and shoulders shifting under the matted fur. Then it stood up, turned, and looked directly at the camera. The IR light reflected off its eyes, turning them into 2 glowing white orbs. It knew the camera was there. It had known all along. It stared for a full 10 seconds. Then it raised its hand, the one with the claws, and made a gesture. It wasn't aggressive. It was a clear, deliberate, beckoning motion. Come here. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a dumb beast. This was a thinking opponent. It was communicating with me. It was telling me it knew I was watching. It was inviting me to the next move in its game. That night, I knew it would come for me. The pretense was over. I didn't go to the security office. I stayed in my small cabin, a separate building about 200 yards from the main house. I sat in the dark, my cig on the table in front of me, along with a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with slugs. I had a digital audio recorder, the kind we used for interviews, running on the table. I don't know why I turned it on. Maybe it was the instinct to document, to leave a record. Maybe I just wanted some proof, one way or the other. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke around midnight. The wind and rain were a welcome cover. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A single, heavy footstep on the wooden porch outside my front door. It wasn't a creak from the wind. It was a deliberate, weighted sound. I picked up the shotgun, my hands slick with sweat. The doorknob, a simple brass lever, began to turn. Slowly, methodically. It wasn't being rattled or forced. It was being manipulated, tested. Then came a soft scratching sound at the door frame. Not the sound of an animal trying to get in. It was the precise, delicate sound of a claw tracing the seam, looking for a weakness. I stood in the middle of the room, aiming the shotgun at the center of the door, my heart hammering against my sternum. The scratching stopped. A new sound began. A low hum, almost too low to hear. It wasn't coming from outside. It felt like it was coming from inside my own head. The pressure in my ears built, and the room seemed to shrink around me. The hum grew louder, resolving into a discordant chorus of clicks and guttural whispers. And then, the images started. They weren't memories. They were projected into my mind, vivid and unwanted. I saw the forest, not as I saw it, but as a matrix of scent and sound. I saw the world through its eyes. I saw the fence not as a barrier, but as an annoyance, a puzzle to be solved. I saw myself, a small, fragile figure in its world, a strange-smelling creature that carried a stick that made loud noises. The audio recorder on the table was still running. I could see its small red light blinking, and I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was the confession. This was the testimony. It wasn't speaking to me in words. It was showing me. It showed me what it was. Not one thing, but many. It showed me flashes of a long, long history, of hiding in the deep places of the world, of watching the noisy, short-lived creatures, us, build our bright, fragile cages. It communicated a sense of ancient lineage, of a species that had watched the ice ages come and go. And then it showed me the children. The images were not violent or gory. They were worse. It showed me a child's playground at dusk. The bright colors of the plastic slide, the empty swings moving slightly in the breeze. And it projected a feeling. Not hunger, as I would understand it. Not malice. It was a feeling of selection, of assessment. It showed me a child laughing
separated from their parents for just a moment at a campsite.
And the feeling that washed over me from the creature's mind was one of profound, instinctual recognition. It wasn't seeing a human child. The concept didn't translate. It was seeing potential. It was seeing a vessel. It communicated that the young of our species were malleable, that their minds were not yet hardened into the rigid patterns of adulthood, that they could be changed, imprinted upon, taken and made into something new. It wasn't about food. It was about propagation. It was a cuckoo looking for a nest. The horror of it was absolute. It wasn't a monster that wanted to eat our children. It was a monster that wanted to be our children, that wanted to steal them and replace them, to continue its own ancient solitary line. The confession wasn't one of guilt. It was a statement of biological imperative, as natural and amoral as a wolf hunting a deer. This is what we do. This is what we are. The pressure in my head became unbearable. I felt a scream building in my chest, but I couldn't make a sound. The last image it showed me was of my own face, reflected in its amber eyes. And the feeling it projected was not hatred or anger. It was disappointment. Disappointment that I was too old, too rigid, that I was not a suitable candidate. The doorknob stopped turning. The presence at the door was gone. The humming in my head faded, leaving behind a silence that felt like a physical wound. I collapsed to the floor, the shotgun clattering beside me. I lay there for hours, shaking, as the full, awful weight of what I had been shown settled into every corner of my mind. When the sun finally rose, I was a different man. The world I knew, the one with its neat rules and predictable human evils, was gone. In its place was a world far older, darker, and more fundamentally alien than I could have ever imagined. I stumbled over to the table and stopped the audio recorder. Its little digital counter showed it had been running for just over 4 hours. I packed a single bag. I wiped down every surface I had touched in the cabin. Then I walked to the main house, found Mr. Reed, and told him I was resigning, effective immediately, for personal health reasons. He was shocked, but he saw the look in my eyes and didn't argue. He just wrote me a check and had his driver take me to the nearest regional airport. I never looked back. I spent the next month in a cheap motel room, hundreds of miles away, just listening to that recording over and over. On the surface, it was mostly useless. The first 3 hours were just the sound of the storm. Then, for about 20 minutes, there was a low-frequency hum, a sound that audio engineers I later consulted called an unidentified persistent resonance. Woven into the hum were the clicks and guttural noises, too complex to be random, but not structured like any known language. And underneath it all, you could hear my own breathing, ragged and panicked. But I knew what wasn't on the tape. I knew the images, the feelings, the sheer weight of that ancient, alien consciousness pressing in on me. The recording was just the carrier wave. The message had been delivered directly to my brain. I reached out to Foster again. I sent him a copy of the audio file.
He got back to me a week later. We ran it through every analysis program we have, Art. Spectral analysis, linguistic pattern recognition, you name it. Nothing. It's just noise. But a few of the old hands, the guys who worked on some esoteric Cold War projects, they recognized the frequency of that hum. They said it's similar to some of the early psychotronic weapon experiments. Stuff that was designed to induce fear and paranoia directly into the brainstem. But this is a naturally occurring version of it, a biological weapon. He paused. The official file is closed, article. Contaminated sample, unexplained audio anomaly. It's over. But you and I know it isn't. Whatever you stumbled onto, it's not in our books. It's something else. My advice? Forget it. Bury it. Live your life. But I couldn't. How do you forget that? How do you go back to worrying about mortgages and politics when you know what's really walking in the woods? How do you look at a child in a park without feeling a cold dread, without seeing them through the eyes of that thing, as a vessel, a potential? I started digging. I used my old skills to access archives, old case files, newspaper databases. I looked for patterns, missing persons cases in or near national parks, focusing on children who vanished without a trace. The official explanation was always the same: animal attack, got lost, parental abduction. But when you line them up, dozens of them, hundreds of them, stretching back over a century, a pattern emerges. The locations, the circumstances, the strange reports from other witnesses that were dismissed as unreliable. The stories of a tall, hairy man or a big wolf walking on two legs. The folklore of native tribes from those same areas. Stories of shapeshifters and child stealers that they treated not as myths, but as historical warnings. It was all there. A hidden history. A silent predation that has been going on right under our noses for generations. The thing I saw, the thing I recorded, wasn't a singular monster. It was a species, and its survival depended on us. It had admitted it. That was its confession. It had shown me the single most horrible truth of my life. We are not the only intelligent life on this planet, and the other one sees our children as a crop. My life since then has been small. I live in a city now, surrounded by concrete and noise. I don't go near the woods. I don't go camping. I check the locks on my apartment door 3 times before I go to bed. I'm a ghost. The man I used to be, the confident, skeptical federal agent, he died in that cabin. This person who's left, he just carries the memory. He carries the warning. People call these things Dogman, Sasquatch, Wendigo. They give them names to try and make them understandable, to fit them into a box. But they don't fit. They are something other. Something that was here long before us, and plans to be here long after we're gone. And the most terrifying part is that they are not our enemies. We are their ecosystem. We are their future. The recording sits on a hard drive on my desk. I listen to it sometimes, late at night. I don't hear the hum or the clicks anymore. I hear the silent, patient testimony of a predator, explaining its nature to a creature too arrogant to have ever considered that it might be prey. I'm sharing this now because burying it, as Foster suggested, feels like a betrayal. A betrayal of every child who ever vanished from a campsite, every family left with a hole in their lives that has no explanation. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe I did have a psychotic break in that isolated cabin. It would certainly be a more comforting explanation. But I have the hair sample. I have the memory of that intelligent amber gaze, and I have the recording of a confession that will haunt me until the day I die. What it admitted about children wasn't just that it takes them. It's that it takes them to make more of itself. It's a continuation, a remaking. And somewhere out there, in the deep woods, there are things that might have once been human children, looking out at the world through ancient, alien eyes. That's the truth I have to live with. And now, so do you.